from the South Coast, having been at a CE and STA combined site visit this morning down on Bournemouth Beach, and what a fabulous place it's been. But Salisbury wasn't too good on the traffic front, so apologies for me skating in a couple of minutes late. We are, I see, waiting for a number of people looking at the participants list, so we'll give it another minute, I think, before we start officially. We are expecting around about 80 people today, so only about 50% of those that are due to come are here. So just bear with us if you could. We'll give it another 60 seconds if we could. So where are we time wise? Let me have a look at my screen. There we go. Oh yeah, we'll give it another little minute. So hope you're all well. Sun is shining, and while we're waiting, Abraham's kindly put up the survey on the screen. So as usual, if you'd like to go to slido.com with today's hashtag LM270522, which won't have escaped your knowledge or your it's today's date, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's good. Right, what do you think? Do you think we ought to make a start, folks? So I'm a very much out of breath Andrew Carpenter, and I'm Chief Executive of the STA and Constructing Excellence in the Southwest and the Midlands. And I'm joined in hosting these weekly Friday webinars by all my colleagues in the CE family and also the CIOB. You can see now on the screen all the logos of the participants, of those that bring this webinar to you each week. Delighted that Katie Saunders can give up some of her valuable time to be with us today. Katie and I sit on the board of the Housing Forum together, and I know what she has to say today will be of interest to many of you, certainly judging from the number of people that have signed up. As you can see from the title, funding modular housing is what we're talking about today. And Katie is with, again, as you can see on the screen, Trowers and Hamlins. And I've actually got a copy of the document that Katie will be talking about. So I can promise you a very interesting and valuable session. Shall we go then to the survey and the questions, Abraham? Let's put those up on the screen, shall we? So very simple. Have you worked on a modular housing project? So this is to try and judge the audience. So yes, you have, or no, you haven't. That's question one. Question two, Abraham. What do you consider the benefits of offsite construction? So that's going to be an open-ended question, I'm assuming. It's not a multi-choice. And the third one, please. What concerns might you have working on a modular house? So put your answers down to those. Now, Katie, because I skated in late, I don't know whether you want to go through the answers now before you speak, or whether you want to keep them to the end. What do you think?
I think it'd be really good to find out now, actually, because okay. I think then my presentation might be a bit more bespoke. So
okay. Well, we've only got 10 people answered at the moment. So okay. Come on, folks. There's nearly 50 people in the room. Only 20% have given an answer. So please go to slido.com, hashtag LM270522, and let's give Katie an idea of those of you that have been involved in modular housing. Only 11 people at the moment. Come on, folks, get your smartphones out now and go to slido.com. This is meant to be an interactive session, so your involvement is critical. It's still stagnated at 11, but well, let's go with what we've got, Katie. So it's sort of a bit of an even split there. Even split, those that have and those that haven't. Is that sort of normal for you? Are you finding that sort of half the people now have actually dipped their toe in the
I think
water?
that's good. I think that's a good percentage. I think probably I would have thought it'd be more like 30%, maybe 20 or 30%. So yes, it's great. We've got some people who are obviously working on the project, which I mean, I think we've got a really informed decision. Oh, it's gone down because I said that. But anyway.
Yeah. One more person's responded who obviously was a no. Okay, let's go to question 2 then, shall we please, Abraham? Right. So what do you consider the benefits? So looks like quality is the big one. Reduction in waste, deliverability, cost certainty, design, reduce carbon footprint, speed, quality, etc. So most of the benefits that I'm aware of seem to be there. Are there any that are missing, Katie, from your perspective?
Well, you'll see when I get to the results, but that actually does reflect the results of our survey, that quality was really top of the agenda. So that's really good to see that is, our survey and this survey, obviously thinking on the same lines.
Good. Okay. And question 3 then, Abraham, please. What concerns might you have working on modular housing? So cost seems to be the big one there. Is that the same as your survey?
I think, I will come to some other things. I think there's the capacity of the market, the sort of, reliability, resilience, those issues I think are concerns.
So fire stopping, I can see there. Is there reliability of the supply chain, maintenance, refurbishment? So yeah, lots of issues there to consider. And as you say, I know skills has now come out equal top, along with cost. So okay, well I know you'll cover a lot of this in your presentation, Katie. What I would suggest, ladies and gents, we'll let Katie proceed in a moment with the presentation. As Katie goes through her presentation, as always, if you could go to slido.com with any questions you might have, and then we'll go through a Q&A session once Katie's finished. But right now, Katie, I think the best thing for me to do is to go on mute and turn my camera off and let you share your screen. How does that sound?
Okay, that sounds good. Right, I will share my screen now, which
Thanks,
hopefully...
Katie. And I'll come back later and we'll lead on the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, right. So hopefully everyone can see that. I shall make it a little bit bigger so that everyone can... There we go. Great. So as Andrew has said, this session is really sort of, it's going to obviously speak to the audience. Some people have done some modular housing projects, some people haven't. But I'm just sort of to go a bit of background for those people who haven't, and then into the results of the survey that we undertook, which, as I said, has some similarities to the very quick straw poll we've just taken. So who am I? I'm Katie Saunders, partner in our project construction team at Trowers and Hamlins. We've been working on modular housing projects for well, I was going to say over 20 years, but we did some projects which I think were very popular in the market probably 20, 25 years ago. We've not had much activity since then, and particularly in the public sector housing market, until more recently over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, where we're really seeing this as being an alternative method of construction to fill the housing market, inspired by Mark Farmer with his obviously groundbreaking report. And we've certainly seen a real interest and enthusiasm, as well as anxiety at the same time, with looking at sort of new and more innovative methods of construction. So I've been looking at this with our team for over quite a few years now, and we've held a number of sort of workshops and roundtables with clients and manufacturers and suppliers to really think about how best we can bring this together in a contractual way, working in collaborative procurement, obviously under umbrella of constructing excellence themes, but also how to overcome some of those hurdles as well that have been perceived in the market. It's worth saying, as Andrew said, I'm on the board of the Housing Forum, which gives us an insight, obviously, as to what the whole housing sector are thinking. And I'm also chair of the Constructing Excellence Northwest or Manchester Best Practice Club as well. And we've had some really interesting discussions in the Northwest about this as well. So I'll try and bring that all together in one hit, but I won't talk for too long because I know there's going to be sort of discussion and questions afterwards. So what I was going to cover, for the people who haven't worked on modular housing projects, what we're talking about, start off with why there is a driver for change, picking up Mark Farmer's report, but also other reports in terms of the fact that we need to deal with skill shortage, impact on quality of homes, and also ESG. Some little points about contractual considerations on MMC projects, and I know the Constructing Excellence Southwest Group produced a booklet, I think, looking at some of the contractual issues you might want to consider when you're dealing directly with manufacturers if you're a client, and some of the considerations were different to a more traditional design and build project. Then on to the funding topic, which is obviously critical, and the results of a survey that we undertook back in August, which will be hopefully of interest, and then we can talk about what happens next, and then questions and discussion. So back to the basics. This, again, I've mentioned him 3 times now, but Mark Farmer, in that report, he looked at obviously what needs to be changed, what the broken sort of housing market and construction sector, and as a result of that, he was appointed as the champion of sort of off-site manufacture by DCRG, as it was DLUC now, and as part of that, he put together a category list of what we're actually talking about when we talk about off-site manufacture, which I'm sure you've seen, but is sort of now standard definition. And I think where we're working particularly is around 1 and 2. I think most people think of 1, which is that sort of volumetric, fully volumetric solution, as being what we're talking about when we talk about modular housing. But actually more and more, it's now really looking at panelised systems, use obviously of timber frame systems in category 2. But that hopefully is something you're well aware of at the moment. Why do we need to necessarily change the way we build our homes? Well, I think there is a massive driver now from the funders to really look at not just the issues around quality, which we've seen as a result of the Grenfell Tower disaster, but also the environmental impact of construction just generally. So this came out in just the answers you gave immediately as to what why the benefits of off-site manufacture, but the environmental impact in terms of reducing waste, increasing energy efficiency of the built homes, reducing carbon in both in construction and use, and improving quality, which was obviously top of the list on your survey as well. And I think the social aspect, the S element of ESG, looking at skill shortages, the importance of trying to get more people into the construction sector, but people being put off by the perceived muddiness of being on site, outdoors, long hours, having to travel around the country. Whereas if we could really create jobs that are much more structured inside in a factory environment where you can have shift patterns, can we attract, and there's more digital and tech in there, is that going to make young people, or even people who have parenting and caring responsibilities, able to fit in a job that is in a factory rather than that involves travel and being outside, that is not as attractive these days as it used to be. Safer homes, that's really important. We just mentioned in that pop-up survey, fire safety, compartmentalisation, the issues around still the legacy issues from Grenfell Tower, and making sure that the homes that people live in are safer, and how we control that quality and that safety by manufacturing in a factory where it's much more precise, and the ability to be able to do pop-up local factories. I think there have been perceived issues, and certainly we looked at this with the Housing Forum, that you wouldn't be able to address local labour supply issues if you had factories which were delivering to sites a long way away. But now, there's much more emphasis on trying to put pop-up local factories by some of the manufacturers near to the sites that they're working on. And the G for governance is really, I think, the impact of having control over the supply chain, not just while we're talking about the quality issues and the information and digital information about where you're getting materials from, but now in terms of actually pricing and dealing with the fluctuations and inflation as well. So clearly, I know I'm always preaching to the converted in these sorts of sessions, but there does seem to be a mode why we should be driving for that change. One thing I wanted to address, which is, I know it's not necessarily directly on topic, but it's something that I'm sure people will ask about, is what are the things you need to think about differently when you're embarking on a modular housing project, or any off-site manufactured project where a large component part of the project is being manufactured off-site. Just put 4 things up there. Obvious things in terms of transportation and logistics, but contractually, how are you making sure the responsibility for the products in the factory, who are owning them, who's taking the risk of them, who then takes the risk for them in transportation and delivery, and when do they incorporate into the project, sort of things we talk about in off-site materials arrangements. The word vesting certificate is not something that manufacturers are very keen on, and I totally understand why. The idea that you would obviously, as a client, take ownership of your product, your volumetric product that's actually in the factory being built as it's being built, is something is a difficult one to actually label up and say this is mine. And what would happen, if that manufacturer wasn't there anymore, would you go and get it? It's more difficult than a pile of bricks on site saying this is now ours and that's going to be incorporated in the project. So I understand that's difficult. I understand that's difficult for the manufacturers to label up everybody's individual parts of their finished modular home, but certainly it needs to be discussed. I think there needs to be education with understanding how the factory operates and how ownership passes when they come to site as well. We've had a lot of discussion, and actually full-time Mark Farmer, but Mark Farmer did lead a whole sort of discussion within Dealer about bringing together the warranty providers who provide latent defects cover, the NHBCs, LABCs, Premier, etc., and try and have some combined accreditation and warranty process. Now, that has still in process. I think the warranty providers have come much more on board with inspecting within factories and are absolutely spot on in terms of accreditation, but they are also quite demanding. So some manufacturers are being accredited, some are then losing their accreditation, and sort of dealing with that within the contract structure, that you need to make sure you're getting the right accreditation, the right warranty process, and what happens if they lose accreditation, how you're going to do that through a scheme. And then payment is something different, just in terms of the way you would structure milestone payments, more advanced payments, as you can imagine, to keep the cash flow going for the factory, securing slots, and making sure that obviously the upfront payment for those materials as they're being processed through the factory into completed units is dealt with within the contract form, rather than it being paid much more on sort of interim payments during the actual construction on site. So we've worked, as you can imagine, on dabbling in adapting the standard forms, because everyone likes a good standard form to use, particularly JCT design and build. We tinkered around because there's still perception that we'd like to have turnkey relationships. We've also looked at dealing with supply only, supply and install only contracts as well, to try and deal with all of these issues. This is not a surmountable problem, but it does just need to be thought about in a slightly different context if you're embarking on a more traditional construction project. So onto this sort of the survey, which is the reason Andrew asked me to have a talk to you about today. So this was really had a history in a roundtable we held in November 2019, where we looked at where there were funding barriers. I'm really conscious people don't want to talk about barriers anymore, but most of those have been broken down. So we looked at why, particularly the public sector, were not taking forward looking at these methods in more detail. And that was a perception around funding, particularly for registered providers who have to put their properties into charge when they've been completed, in order to have security for their loans. And they were concerned that the lenders would not do that if a certain proportion of their stock had been built using off-site methods. Understanding, realization that these products was just the same as a traditional product. So we looked at that, and we sort of did a report looking at all the concerns that people had at that point. I've just saying the connection is unstable, but hopefully people can still hear me.
We are losing you a little bit, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. You're sort of coming in and out.
Oh dear, I'm sorry about that.
That's better now. That's better now.
Okay. It might have just been overloaded. I'll just keep my screen so I can see that people are still there. All right, I'll try and put that back up again. Hopefully it's come back. Okay. So the results of the survey. So we did this survey back in November 2019, and we did a further survey to try and see whether things had changed. And the results overwhelmingly are that the barriers we'd seen in 2019 had been broken down considerably. And I think it was early this year, or was it the back end of last year, we actually had the Green Square Accord groundbreaking deal, which really was a groundbreaking deal, where THFC, the Housing Finance the Housing Finance Corporation, did fund the Green Square Accord local homes, which had been built quite a long time before, and hadn't put them into their security portfolio, and they did that, and that was successful with backup from warranty providers, and confirmation in terms of life cycle sort of understanding of how long some of the component parts were going to last, and that was inputted by the sort of surveyors and valuers. So that was really successful. So we've sort of really got over that hurdle now. There are some other hurdles that I think we can discuss as still to overcome. The cost that came up in the survey. So capital cost, is it more expensive? We're finding that more schemes are being built using modular housing method in the south, southeast and southwest, because possibly the figures stack up better than in the north, northeast and northwest, where the land prices are lower, and the cost of, the ability to be able to sell is lower as well. So certainly cost is probably still a hurdle. Data, I think this is absolutely crucial, understanding that the homes when built will last exactly the same time as a traditional product, because you've got some data around that, but we haven't got a combined sort of set of data. This, I know the Homes England have commissioned a whole research project around this, so that data will be coming together in a more standard manner, but that's not there yet. So there is some degree of leap of faith that you're trusting the data that's been put forward by manufacturers, and assuming that was not, plus independent advice by surveyors to check that, and ongoing maybe assessments of the viability of those homes to check that they are holding up and just as sustainable and have the same duration as a traditional home. I mentioned this issue about sort of resilience in the market, vulnerability of the manufacturing market to insolvency without a guarantee. Now, we've got a chicken and egg situation about manufacturers going bust, but yet they're not providing them with a pipeline to stop them from that happening. So we a tipping point, I think, at the moment. People have got to embrace it, or we will see some manufacturers really disappearing because they're just not getting that commitment. But I mean, I think there is movement where the house builders, the strategic partners of Homes England, are being encouraged, or indeed forced, to have 25% of their homes built using MMC methods, are now securing pipelines for those manufacturers. So it's the private sector are going to secure those, which means the public sector can stop being quite so wobbly and get involved as well. Alignment of accreditation and latent defects insurance is obviously something I said that's been worked on by DLUC, but trying to have that, some sort of combination of products that it means that the latent insurers can go in and credit one manufacturer, and that the insurers can roll up on that, and without having sort of double accreditations with different sort of standards that they need to meet. And then standardization of components. We've been talking about this for such a long time in different sectors, but certainly standardizing components for the house sector, whether that's in refurb or new build, is absolutely crucial to really being able to roll this out at much more volume. So getting into the results of the survey, this is, as Andrew said, he's got a copy, so he's been looking at this detail. I hope you can sort of see some of that. I'll try and unpick it, but I'll go through it, not just that particular slide, I'll go through it in a bit more detail with these subsequent slides. So what we really want to get to the nub of is whether we're looking at the public sector or the private sector, where's the money coming from? We've seen some, private equity investors into some of the manufacturers, Goldman Sachs being a prime example, investing in Top Hat. Or I'm going to say that the right way around. I think that's the right way around. We've also got Ilco who have a private sector investor as well. So we are seeing those in terms of how the manufacturers are being funded, but in terms of actual projects, capital finance for projects, we're still seeing quite a emphasis on grant funding. So the one in the middle there, or the second one in where it says HA local authority, obviously that's quite a big pink bit, and that's the Homes England GLA grant. So they're obviously mainly public sector projects are being funded by public sector money. So for private developers looking at funding or equity finance, and similar across the board in terms of top-ups with loan finance. So that's in terms of capital expenditure. We were quite interested to see whether there were some differences about securing that capital finance. Was that different? Were different demands being placed on the developers or the local authorities or housing associations? And again, the pink is no different. So still quite a sort of particularly in the public sector, that there wasn't much difference between securing that funding, maybe a bit more of a difference, a bit harder for the private developers to secure that funding. And then why is that? Were there additional requirements placed on the project compared to a traditional project? Pretty balanced in terms of private developers. Yes and no for the housing associations, local authorities, but the funders were saying that yes, we were playing a bit more, 60%. We were putting additional obligations on, which obviously hadn't quite got reflected down to the people that they were lending to. But it's something that we were quite keen, and certainly I know that the valuers are quite keen to try and avoid having to have an extra sort of a two-tier approach where yes, you have the modular homes, but you've got to go through so many more hoops for these compared to a traditional scheme. Really, we want to try and get to a balance where it's proportional, because the products do stack up and that we've got data to demonstrate that. What are your main motivations using M&C? Well, this is similar to the question I asked at the start, which is, what do you see the benefits? And this is a little bit more difficult, a little bit trickier to unpick, but build quality was pretty high up, which is sort of right at the bottom. We've split that into the sort of the across the market. So from everybody, because the build quality is the one that goes all the way to the 80%, over 80%. So private developers, housing associations, local authorities, funders, manufacturers and consultants all said build quality was the main motivation. And that's a really powerful message, isn't it, in terms of coming out of, where we're looking at really poor quality housing and trying to improve quality. So that's, I think that slide is really, really positive, but lots of other things that weren't necessarily expecting to see, but we're hoping for, I suppose. Improved life cycle cost savings, cutting down waste, reductions on-site manpower, ESG agenda. Well, I think that's sort of catch-all, that covers everything. And then reduced household running costs was the other aspect on that one that came up pretty highly. And that's, I think for the believers, that's really good news. Looking at the sort of back end finance. So once you've built the homes, where do you put them in as security? Obviously, this is really relevant for housing associations. And so far, as you say, we haven't had that many go into a big charging portfolio apart from that THFC deal. I think more and more are creeping in because they're a small percentage of the overall and not given, massive attention now, which is great. But, it is pleasing to see that funders are now very much more comfortable as using modular homes as security for loan facilities. Are they valued differently? I mean, this was the perception within the private developers and the housing association was it wasn't massive, but for funders and insurers, yes, it was. So, I mean, we had quite a few funders and insurers respond, but, that are they, is this something where we need to work on? How do we need to try and change the way that modular homes are being valued? And is data key to this is probably my big question. And then, of course, a question that we would all like more government funding for everything, but are they providing enough? I think in particular around the cost, the capital cost element, is there additional grant available? That question's been asked of Homes England quite a lot. Can you give us additional grant in order to sort of prime some of these schemes, so at least we can get one or two going, and then we can see the benefits and the efficiencies of getting better production through the factory, which means the cost will come down. But on that capital expenditure at the start on the first projects, can we get some extra grant? And I think there has been some flex, but not as a sort of policy statement. So yes, I mean, there's obviously a requirement. It'd be great if we could get more funding in order to get some of these schemes up and running and give that sort of confirmation, that certainty to the manufacturing pipeline. But whether we'll see that as a policy statement is difficult to know. Homes England, the guy who was on the panel at UK Construction Week, wasn't going to be drawn on that particularly, as you can imagine. Then on to the sort of barriers. We did still talk about barriers, or now trying to talk about them as hurdles, but the barriers, again, quite a dense sort of way of presenting that data. But the things that sort of strike most was more about that. Well, I mean, there's a combination, I suppose, from the public sector, which is the pink valuation was restricted valuation. That's probably the top one that came out. On the private developer, which is the lighter blue, what was their biggest concern? Lack of familiarity with the process of delivering MMC projects. That was sort of a barrier, that they just hadn't the skills, the resources. Lack of understanding about sort of testing regime, the sort of accreditation. Pick up another one. Concerns about fire safety was, I suppose, something that quite a lot of both the housing associations and local and private developers were concerned about as well. And then, of course, we tried to turn it on its head and say, well, how can you overcome these? More money obviously helps. Additional government grants. What about popular choice? Providing case studies and learning and education. Certainly the developers that felt that would be helpful. Creating consortiums of manufacturers to offer standardized components. The funders and insurers. No, I think it was more the. I'm now getting my mixed. Who thought that was a private developer was quite keen on that. Local and housing association, local authorities trying to collaborate and aggregate demand, and also provide some sort of standardized products as well. So a sort of mixed bag, really. Minimum standards set by government to create a pipeline. Well, they've obviously done that through Homes England and the 25% for the strategic partners. Guidance and training, education, having some standard guarantees. Time and widespread use was one of the, just generally we're going to evolve with time, sort of needs must. Actually having some standards. I know that DLUC are thinking about, or certainly working on, an ISO at the moment, so that would be really good. And as I say, aggregating demand with sort of collaborative procurement as well. So what next? And this is sort of the last bit, just really thinking, where do we go from here? So I do feel that we're at a tipping point. We're certainly seeing much more commitment from the house builders, developers, to those manufacturers, particularly people like Ilka and Top Hat through their order books, and that's obviously going to give them much more certainty. We need that, then the public sector to really provide that certainty. We've set up, we've been involved in setting up a number of procurement groups to do that. Building Better is one of the big ones. We've brought together a number of RPs. We've got a consortium called the Off-Site Homes Alliance in the Northwest, led by Great Places, which is again aggregating demand there. London Housing Consortium have got modular frameworks. We've got Crown Commercial Service with a modular framework. So there's lots of places where you can go to get engaged with manufacturers that have been procured properly, but now you actually need a commitment to secure the pipeline. As I said, I think the mood to try and bring those needs and demands together to aggregate demand is really important. But maybe the real telling story to make that change possible is funders only starting to invest in housing which is sustainable and that meets their targets. I know that the funders, and ever since I think Pete Gladwin from Legal and General came to talk to a housing forum event, and this is probably going back quite a long time now, 10 plus years ago, and said this would be great. L&G would like to invest in the social housing sector. We can really see obviously the social benefits, but also the long-term income streams as a sort of groundbreaking move into the social housing sector. Obviously the social aspects there, but the quality and the environmental aspects need to be delivered as well. And it's not just a given because it's social housing that it's going to deliver on all those ESG targets. So looking at delivering housing which is more environmentally sustainable seems to me something that funders will be demanding more as they invest in the affordable housing market, as well as the private developer market as well. But the caveats are we need to have that capacity. We've talked about this a lot, I know, in a number of forums, and trying to build that capacity, providing that security of pipeline, and then providing that resilience in the market itself. So plenty of things to think about. That is really all I was going to cover. Hopefully I haven't gone on for too long. There's a chance for questions. Those are my details there.
Katie, thank you very much. Yes, I do indeed have the the document in front of me, so yeah. I was following it. Before we get on to the questions, there's a comment in the chat box which you can probably see from Alan Yates, good friend of mine, both CE and Structural Timber Association, who's made a comment. He's surprised to see that the program delivery, reduced delivery time on site is not coming out as a target for clients. Wondered if you had a comment to make about that before we go into the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Because we've certainly seen, well, maybe my observation is that possibly that's because we had a sort of research from the public sector than private sector, because the schemes that have obviously been sort of groundbreaking in terms of, on build to rent schemes, the sort of the Grey Star, those sorts of build to rent companies who've put up tower blocks using quite a lot of volumetric methods. They've got that groundbreaking tower in Croydon, haven't they, which has been built to be one of the tallest towers that has modular components. That this seems to be absolutely obvious. The shorter you get on, time you get on site, the quicker you get the homes in place, the quicker you get people in, and the rental stream comes forward. I think from house builders and developers, of course, it is subject to demand. Bringing forward everything very, very quickly is great, but you don't want to over saturate the market. But you'd think for the public sector they'd have the same requirement to we need more homes, we need them quicker, we need people to get people in them, therefore reduce times on site should be a bonus. But so that is interesting. I think
interesting for me. It's very topical for me. As I say, I was late in slightly this afternoon because I was on a site visit in Bournemouth this morning, which was for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council, which was a timber frame project which was put up very quickly, but they're now being held up by the services who still seem to be using the same timescale as a traditional project. So that's an interesting one, I think, where we need to get the whole supply chain aligned and managed accordingly. Right, Abraham, could we have the questions maybe one at a time so that we know what we're doing? So now then, Mr. F.T. Carter has asked 3 of the 4 questions. So folks, get asking some questions so that we can broaden it. But I know Fred of old, and I know he's heavily involved in the sector, and asks, I think, a very pertinent question at this moment in time. Are the recent failures of Caledonian and Urban Splash a sign of things to come in the modular housing sector? What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously something that's been talked about quite a lot in the last few months. I think that it was a shock that Caledonian has gone into administration, particularly as they went. As you say, they had a much more broader span of and longevity in terms of the modular housing market, in terms of supplying not just for housing, but also the pub, prisons, and they've had such a sort of journey, haven't they? They've obviously had not just doing housing, and they have been in education and say prison accommodation, things like that. So I think that was a surprise. I think the inside story is that there were obviously other things at stake in terms of the way the business was run. And it's not just about modular, it was more about the way the business was run. But of course, that's what people would say if they're trying to support the modular sector. The Urban Splash one, I had some interesting story that it was because Urban Splash had actually become too bespoke, and had obviously the secret of their success and their stories that you could go and, as a private own homeowner, you could really bespoke your own home, and that bespokeness had actually meant that it wasn't as standardized and therefore was adding additional cost. And of course they've done a number of joint ventures with the public sector as well, and so again real shame, but maybe the product had become too bespoke, and consequently the lack of standardization had meant that was not unsustainable. But you're right.
We've been, if I take my CE hat off and put my STA hat on just for a few seconds, we've been actually watching what's been happening in the modular and volumetric market with interest, because obviously my members are offering panelized type 2 offsite, which of course has been around for a long time and is tried and tested, and there are hundreds of businesses doing well. And so I'm not sure that volumetric part of the offsite is really settled yet. if I'm honest. This is from a panelized point of view, but I'll take my STA hat off and put the CE one back on and say that obviously if we're going to build these 300,000 homes a year, although I note Michael Gove has taken that number off the table now. But if we're going to build these additional homes, we need more of everything, don't we? We need it all to work. And it's a great shame that we've lost Caledonian and Urban Splash. And am I right in saying, Katie, Caledonian did all the units for Hinkley Point? I'm sure they did. They did 1,000 units.
Might be right. Yeah, I'm not sure. You're right. I think
1,000 units in Bridgewater and 500 on site, I think. Anyway, let's go to the next question from Fred. I think is coming up another one. Do you feel the doubling in base material cost of steel will be the death knell for the lightweight steel modular housing sector, as costs cannot be viable?
I mean, that's a really, absolutely. Chris, it is. I mean, what can I say about that? I mean, you're right. It's obviously going to put a pinch point on everything, isn't it? Not just modular housing. Whether there can be elements of being able to control some of those costs better, with a manufacturing factory environment than it is with traditional, as a debatable. We were just hoping that this, we're all going to have to weather a slight storm, aren't we? And actually that's interesting. Someone's put another comment in. That we're the traditional construction market is going to struggle as well, and we've had a number of insolvencies in traditional as well. We have in modular, so you're right. It's we need to do something to support the whole of the market, not just the modular side. But I think there is, as you said, Andrew, there is more. It is more perilous that the sort of the volumetric modular housing, where we've been very successful in doing that for hotels, apartments, student accommodation, that no one is really sort of worrying about those elements. It is when we've moved into the much more personal, customer focused housing market that it's there's been more of a struggle, hasn't it? So
I mean, but the material cost of building materials is actually an issue throughout the sector, isn't it? Not just in the off-site sector. It applies to the whole of the construction industry. Availability of material and cost of material is one of the big issues of the moment, as is availability of skills. Two of the big issues. And I don't know, Katie, I think it was a housing forum board meeting where one of our colleagues said that they're actually reducing their program going forward because of the lack of skills and material that they see available. No names, no pat drill, but I think I think
you're right, and there's that pinch point, isn't it? Which is as costs increase, all the projects that were viable are now not viable, and there's no additional money to pay for those. So they're just going to have to mothball them. I mean, that's not what anyone wants to see. We need some support to get through this next, whether it's 6, 12 or 18 months, as costs settle down a little bit. But yes, sorry, I can't predict what that's happening, but it's a good question.
No,
I think we're all, you're right.
Let's go to the next one from Kevin, shall we, Abraham, please? In your surveys, you refer to consultants. Can you expand on this a little more? What do you mean by consultants?
Sorry, well, that was a bit of a group term for architects, project managers, QSs, any sort of designers, I suppose, involved in that. So that was probably, when you tick a box in a survey and you say, are you a contractor? Are you
to be honest, Katie, we in CE circles, as you know, we do that. We put people into 4 boxes. You're either a client, a consultant, which is the professionals, if you like, a contractor, or a supplier, because you have to do that sort of thing, don't you, within these trade bodies. But anyway, thanks for clarifying that. Another one from Fred, I think, is next. Abraham, if we get up the next one. Ilka are the foremost modular provider by numbers, but they have declared losses of circa 100 million over the last 3 years. If they can't be successful, who can? That's a similar question that Fred asked before, because certainly, Ilka have had a lot of money, haven't over the government in the last few years, but as Fred said, have declared quite significant losses.
Yeah, so, I think there's, I suppose what we haven't got is the comparators of some of the other sort of more established manufacturers who are not supplying to the housing, supplying other, education sort of as well. And I think most have acknowledged that that upfront cost of the factory or 2 factories is absolutely crippling until you get going. And I suppose when the worry that everyone has is whether the financial backers of these organizations will keep the faith for long enough to get over this, this initial part. So I don't think it's unusual that you would, declare losses because of the setup costs. LNG is a similar position, aren't they? But it's just whether there's going to be enough time to be able to, without the plug being pulled, to be able to recover from that. And of course, compared to traditional, of course, we've got similar, but it's not that the upfront expenditure is so immense. If you're starting as a small house build developer, you can start small and build upwards. Whereas in manufacturing, you've got to go big, haven't you? And hope you're going to reap the rewards later on.
Okay, we've got some anonymous questions coming in now. Let's answer the first of those. Interested to know how MMC delivery of a number of small sites can be achieved. Volumetric is not an option, and we have looked at smaller, more local organisations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, we bandied around some of the big names, but there are lots of more small, as you say, smaller organisations who are doing much more panelised systems, as Andrew was saying, that might be much more suitable. We work with up in the northwest organisation called Osco Homes, really fantastic outfit who've actually dealt with their skill shortage by building their factory next to Hindley prison in Wigan, and they take prisoners as well as ex-offenders into the prison from the prison into the factory to work on their homes. Anyway, cut a long story short, they're very much in the panelised. They build quite a lot in the factory, but obviously then they take it on site, and they've certainly done more schemes which are smaller and in more sort of difficult sites to access as well. So I think looking around, there are certainly manufacturers who are very experienced in working in those sorts of environments.
Yeah, I mean, to take your point and also to name drop Mark Farmer one more time. If we look at his definitions, volumetric is one of 7. So an off-site solution doesn't have to be volumetric. As I say, STA members work in the definition 2, which is panelised, but you need to look at the whole suite of options, I think, don't you, Katie, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
If the project demands. Let's go to the next question, Abraham, please. When paying up front, how are we protecting clients from potential failure of the manufacturer? There's an interesting one from your legal perspective.
Yeah, it was a number of things. As I mentioned, the sort of dreaded vesting certificate. So having some sort of where you make that payment up front, you have then some sort of lien over the what you've paid for, but then you'd have to go into the factory and try to drag them out and say, well, that belongs to me. Possibly getting some sort of bond, some insurance-backed bond for that payment might be a more sensible option. That would then pay out, obviously, if there was an insolvency event, and you would get the money back to protect that advance payment. So looking at a number of things, but actually I think the most powerful thing, and many of the manufacturers say this, is actually going in and obviously understanding how the factory process operates, where your product, where the bits that are going to form part of your homes, and the understanding how that it actually works, and that perhaps it is quite bespoke to a client, and that if you look at the way that it's operating, it's very clear where your bits are, and that they wouldn't get muddled up with anybody else's bits. That doesn't obviously get around the whole issue if a manufacturer goes under. But the other thing that's been happening with the Offsite Alliance, which is a group of manufacturers who've all come together, is that they're looking at ways that they can buddy up with each other, how they could step in if one went under, how you could actually then bring in another manufacturer to finish off the project. So I think there's certainly acknowledgement that that's something we need to do, because in the traditional sector it's still an absolute nightmare if a contractor goes bust on site. We all know that that's a disaster, contractually, legally, and all sorts of other ways, but it feels like more people come in and finish off that project, whereas actually what the manufacturer's trying to do is trying to replicate that within their own groups as a sort of as buddies, really, and a bit more sort of standardization between all of them as well.
Yeah, and one of your ex-colleagues, Alan Tate, actually led on a document that we produced within CESW, which was a legal guide to offsite. And a lot of questions like this we covered. So if anyone's interested, go on to the Constructing Excellence Southwest website, look under resources, publications, and you'll see a legal guide to offsite. And this question, along with a lot of others, is actually covered because we saw a whole plethora of clients looking to use MMC, but asking more questions than could be answered. So we put together a team of legal experts to come up with a document. So that is available. Next question, please, Abraham. What is the most suitable form of contract for MMC? Is it the NEC suite?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think there was a bit of pressure and to have a sort of bespoke form for MMC, and that seems to us just a sort of pointless waste of everyone's, legal time and cost, to be fair. I mean, much as we'd love to be commissioned to do a bespoke MMC contract, this is not the biggest thing you need to overcome when you're dealing with a modular project. You need to be looking at the technical side, you look at the site, you look at cost. What can we do to adapt current standard forms? And certainly Construction Playbook has been very sort of vigorously saying, let's not spend loads of money just reinventing the wheel or writing something bespoke. So the answer is you can adapt a standard form if you're thinking of the things that I put in my slide, really. NEC suite is entirely appropriate, particularly if you can use some of sort of the early works sort of elements to getting the manufacturer on board early, so you can work with them in sort of designing if they're going to do some bespoke design for your particular site. So NEC, JCT, we've adapted JCT design build. We've looked at doing purely supply contracts instead of supply and install contracts. The PPC 2000 suite, which obviously has a sort of commencement period, which you can use as well, which is really helpful with multi-party aspects, which is great because you can bring in, the contractors actually doing the groundworks potentially, and then you've got the manufacturers doing the supply and install. Could all be signing up the same contract with the client, plus project managers, etc. So there's not a very good answer, is it? Any standard form, I think, is going to be suitable, but you've got to look at amending it and having a think about how it would operate on your particular scheme, and what are you buying at the end of the day? Is it actually just the supply of the products? Is it supply of the panels, or is it construction? So look at exactly what you're requesting on that particular project.
I mean, certainly if I again put my STA hat on and speak from a manufacturer's point of view, I think it's a contract where the earlier the involvement of the supply chain, the better. To get the real value, not just in MMC, in construction, really, you need to engage the supply chain as early as possible, because that's where a lot of the innovation comes. And very often the procurement route doesn't allow that to take place. I mean, if I go back historically, to my Forty Creek days, we'd be called in about 6 weeks before they needed the product, but we didn't have a cat in hell's chance of innovating. With MMC, to really get it to stack up, I think you need that manufacturer in absolutely early days to affect the design, really. But that's just me speaking from the supply chain. We've got a couple more questions. Is the responsibility for apparent defects clear between a manufacturer and installer on site?
I don't know. That's probably a bit techie for me. I mean, I suppose it depends what you put in the contract, isn't it? I think on some of the earlier sort of public sector housing projects, we've sort of tended to end up being a bit more of a turnkey solution. So design and build, very much sort of the flavour going back to the form of contract. And I don't necessarily think that is necessarily the right way to do things, but it does mean that then you've got sort of whoever's taking the role of the main contractor is taking responsibility for everything, and it's very clear then where responsibility sits. I think you're right. If you've got a supply contract with the manufacturer and a works contract with the sort of groundworks or the installer on site, yes, how are you going to deal with the interface between those two? And whether you have got something written down that explains how you see that interface, or whether you're actually then very much relying upon your project manager on site to be the interface at that point. It's a point that Andrew mentioned before, was just the other element is whose responsibility is it then for getting the services connected as well. So those sorts of elements, if you are trying to pursue a bit more of a sort of your own project management, because you're picking, the installer from here, the manufacturer here, when you're not creating a sort of one-stop shop approach, then you as the client have got to be very specific about that. Otherwise, the responsibility will end up sitting with the client on that, won't they? I don't know whether you want to add anything onto that, Andrew.
Not really. For no other reason, we've got 2 more questions, only a couple of minutes to go.
Okay,
so we're going to have to rush through. Premier and Darwin Group are doing exceptionally well in the NHS, where the frameworks are well established, i.e. Procure 23. Maybe that's the main issue. What do you think?
Well, I'm glad Kevin's mentioned those, because you're right. There's some really great examples outside housing, and there should be no reason why it shouldn't work in housing. Apart from, I suppose, there is customer choice, isn't there? There's that much more discretion, and the way that we operate in housing is we like to have our own homes designed the way we want them to be. Whereas obviously you don't get much choice in the NHS, or if you're in prison, or in some degree student accommodation. It is what it is. A hotel, that's what you're buying. So yes, maybe we have got to think about, and gosh, I'm going to get sort of hate mail from architects, but thinking about it being less bespoke and more standard,
more standardization, and maybe more taking of best practice from other parts of the sector. Yeah. Okay. Final question. Does modular make compliance with the fire safety bill easier than traditional construction?
Oh, that's a good one to end on. It's actually the Act now, because it got Royal Assent a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, that's true, a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
But I think my answer on that is the bit in the Act which covers all buildings, really, in terms of information about where you're getting the golden thread of information coming from Dame Judith. That information is much easier to access if you've really controlled the process. And so the manufacturer should have all the data about what's gone into that home, particularly on a velometric one, which is probably a real benefit for complying with the Fire Safety Act.
And if we go right back, Katie, to that first questionnaire we did, the survey, the big issue was quality, which was the reason we're doing off-site MMC. So the quality and compliance go hand in hand, don't they, really? So good. Okay, Katie, thank you so much. A great session, as you could see from the number of questions that were asked. Before we go, ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to fill in a feedback survey. Easy for me to say.
So everyone's hungry. You've got to feed. It's to do with feeding. It's lunchtime.
Back to slido.com, #LM270522. Fill in that feedback survey, please. We won't go through all the questions. I don't think Abraham on the screen will let people do that in their own time. We'll keep it up for half an hour or so. Can we just put the details up of the CPD, please, Abraham? So if you want to get yourself a CPD certificate, mypropass.co.uk, create your free account, and then your certificate will be stored for you in a single place. And finally, before we go, just to let you know that nothing next week, because we'll all be out celebrating the Queen's Jubilee, 70 years on the throne. So we're back in 2 weeks with Gallagher's, talking about another very important topic, protecting your business with trade credit insurance. Insurance is one of the big issues of the moment. So if that's something which is of interest to your business, please join us in a fortnight. But right now, the time is exactly 1 o'clock. It's a Friday afternoon. I'm going to wish you a very good afternoon and an enjoyable weekend, and see you all in a fortnight. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.